Thanks, Jay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. I think I've met just about everybody here. If not, I'm Corey Buxton. I'm a professor of science education here at Oregon State, and I am the principal investigator of the Lacunos project, Language, Culture, and Knowledge Building Through Science. And one of the things that we'll be doing in Lacunos and through SMILE is working with your students on creating concept maps periodically throughout the year. And we talked about concept maps at a virtual professional development in the fall. And we asked folks, are you familiar with concept maps? Do you use them? Would you like a PD that just sort of focuses on concept maps and what they're good for? And enough people said yes, that is why we developed this workshop today. So the purpose of this workshop is really to think about how concept mapping can support science learning, and then how we're going to try to use it in SMILE and Lacunos. So I want to start with a little sort of reminder, review, framing of Lacunos, because we're going to be using concept maps to try to meet a few of the goals that I want to talk about for just a minute here. So overall in Lacunos, we're trying to develop and test a set of instructional practices and then some tools that help us to do those practices. And we use model lessons as a way to try to bring those practices and tools into a context that we can try them out. But the goal is to then think about how those tools maybe have legs and can travel beyond those model lessons, and we can use them in other things we do in SMILE and maybe beyond SMILE. And within Lacunos, we're particularly interested, we talk about three strands of the Lacunos project, three sort of themes we're most interested in. One of those is focused on language development, and particularly why we need to think about language in science and why language is important for science sense making. And I want to frame each of these as kind of a challenge and a goal. So the challenge I see around language development in science is that we know that students use language not just to show what they know, but we use language to represent who we are. And often the language of science is scary, intimidating, turns some students off. And if you feel intimidated by the language of science, you're unlikely to sort of stay engaged in trying to make sense of science. So our goal around language is to help students really use and understand language in explicit and conscious ways, so that when they're making sense of science, they're making sense of the language in a way that doesn't seem intimidating, and they can take ownership of that language. Our second strand is about culture and community connections. And so one of the challenges here, we know very well in science that many students don't see their culture or their communities or their histories represented in science, not in school and not outside of school. And we know that for anybody to feel engaged and connected to anything, to have interest in something, you have to feel like it fits with your identity. Kids are involved in a lot of identity work, trying to make sense of who they are, what they like, what they're into. And so we can do things to explicitly help students sort of think about their interest in identity in relation to science, and use that hopefully to help them build connections to science and relate that to things that they care about. And then that brings us to the third strand, which is really about the knowledge building. So science is also, it's not just a way of problem solving it, there is a body of knowledge that science has discovered, and we can use some of that knowledge to make informed decisions. But it's not always easy or obvious how to make those decisions. So one challenge is science understanding is often partial, and if we don't apply it to things that have meaning for us, meaningful contexts, then it's always going to be kind of abstract and we're not going to make knowledge that can inform our decisions. So the goal is, we talk a lot about evidence-based explanation, the science and engineering practices and NGSS are all about sort of making explanation, but why? For what purpose? If we're not connecting it to either things we care about, daily decisions we have to make, social challenges we're interested in, then what's it for? So we think that by focusing on these three strands in Lacunos, we can help science seem more meaningful, relevant, and help students make those connections. So that's really what we're about with Lacunos. And so, connecting Lacunos to this idea of concept maps, in this workshop, we're going to learn how to use concept maps to support students' emergent understandings and their emergent communication skills. We're going to highlight a model lesson called If I Were a Tree, to sort of consider how you might introduce concept maps in your SMILE clubs. And then finally, we're going to hopefully connect back to those 3 strands of Lacunos I just talked about and how we can use concept maps to help our students make progress in those areas. So what are concept maps? And I absolutely recognize within this group, there's probably a range of knowledge and experiences around concept maps. I'm going to present this coming from a space of assuming that people aren't familiar with concept maps. I recognize that some of you are, and you will have things you can add to this. But overall, what concept maps are, they're visual representations. So they're multimodal in that regard. They're visual, but they also include words and potentially diagrams and pictures too. But they're a visual representation of our thinking about a topic, and they highlight how we have sort of organized our understanding of that topic, our kind of mental model of that topic in some way. So it's trying to sort of put on paper our understanding of a topic and the concepts and how they connect. And that's what a concept map is. And it can be about anything. So we've got examples here that range from teeth and what they're for to, in the lower right, graduate school and how you sort of make it through graduate school. So concept maps can be about any concept, but it's a visual representation of our mental model of that concept. Next slide. So sort of why concept maps and why have they been used and how have they been used in science education? And concept maps actually come from science education. They're kind of ours. They've been used and extended into other areas, but their history is the history of science teaching. They were developed by science educators and science ed researchers who were interested in understanding students' emergent thinking about a topic. We don't just have right or wrong, yes and no answers to things in our heads. We've got complex models. And yet in school, we often ask questions that don't kind of get at the complexity of those models. So concept maps are a way to try to keep the complexity, keep learning complex. Learning is a very complex process, and we tend to simplify it, but concept maps are a way to try to keep some of the messiness and keep some of the complexity in how we think about things. So they're emergent thinking about a topic, and they focus on conceptual understanding and also our conceptual hierarchies, how we have things organized. It's human nature, I think, to organize things into hierarchies. And they highlight the nature of relationships that we see between concepts. So often we learn things as conceptual chunks, but then the real hard work of science learning is how do those chunks fit together to make broader meaning. And so concept maps can help us study how students do that, and especially how that evolves over time. Some of the most productive use of concept maps is when students are asked to revisit their concept maps later after some additional instruction and think about how their ideas have changed and try to represent not just what they know now, but how it has been a shift from what they understood before. So concept maps have been used in lots of really productive ways in science classrooms, both in research and in practice. But there's also, I've always felt there's a lot more we can learn from concept maps that people have intended to use concept maps for. So I'm interested in exploring some of those things. So why are we using concept maps in Lacunos? So we've got these 3 strands: language, cultural connections, and knowledge building. And I think concept maps can help us understand each of these things in new ways. So there's been very little that has been done with concept maps really focused on the language itself. It's all about, if it looks at language, it's trying to really say, what does the kid understand about a concept, but not how is language being used to articulate that concept. So I think we can look more carefully at the language students use to really get a sense of emergent science communication skills, and that can help us guide the language supports that we provide to students. So I'm very interested in how we can think about students' concept maps that your students produce, that you'll share with us, and that can inform some of the tools that we use to think about the language practices. And similarly with, go back, Jay. Similarly with our culture and community connections, I think concept maps have been used to look at the examples that students draw. So when you do a concept map, it often starts with kind of the more general and moves to more specific, and good concept maps often out towards the edges of concept maps, you see concrete examples. What does this actually look like in real life? And we can do more to guide students to think about where they draw examples from, what they see as sort of valid or legitimate spaces to draw examples and connect to science. And the concept maps, we can use them to help students think about drawing a broader range of examples. And finally, for the knowledge building piece, concept maps can highlight the application of knowledge. Often in science, kids say anyway, we try to make it concrete. I know as teachers, we're always trying to make it concrete, but kids still tell us that science often feels abstract and theoretical. So we can potentially use students' concept maps to help guide them to think about the concept map as evidence-based arguments about decisions. How do we decide how to act in our lives? And that's really practical. So these are some of the ways that I'm hoping that we will use concept maps in Lacunos, but we can only use them if we can generate them with our students. And so the rest of this training today is really focused on what do we do to get kids to generate concept maps? How can we build that into some of the SMILE and Lacunos activities? And then we can use those maps to do some of this work that I am interested in thinking of. Next slide. So you've seen some pictures of concept maps on a few of the slides. Some of you probably are already very familiar with kind of these pieces of a concept map, but typically concept maps, all concept maps have a couple of features. One of those features is there should be a central topic. It could be a concept, it could be a driving question, but there's something either in the middle or at the top that is the most sort of central and generalized thing that we're building from. And in the example that you can see here, it's a very simple example of parts of plants, or we could talk about sort of structure and function of plants. And so our central topic is plants. So it could just be one word, it could be a phrase like structure and function of plants, but your central concept, I like to put it in the center, some people like to put it at the top. You'll see that concept maps often use different shapes or different colors, and that can be used to kind of show levels of hierarchy. Often concept maps either build from the center out or they build from the top down. And in either case, you might use a different color or a different shape, ask your students to do that to show levels of hierarchy. But we have these concepts. So the two main parts of a concept map are concepts and then the links between those concepts. Sometimes people have used the word node. I like the word concept. The concept should be a word or a short phrase, and it should be in a box, in a bubble, like in a shape. That's sort of the norm. It doesn't have to be, but it just makes it cleaner that way. And then the links are the connections between the concepts. And that's really what makes a concept map is that those links need to be labeled. And students don't like to do this. They draw the arrow between their concepts and they go, here's my map. And I'm always like, no, you're not done. You need to tell me what your arrow means, because otherwise I've got to guess. Does your arrow mean cause and effect? Does your arrow mean that it's an example of it? Does it mean that it's a counterexample of it? You need to tell me what that nature of the relationship is. So you've got concepts, you've got the arrows that link concepts, and those can be, as an arrow, the direction matters. They might be two directional arrows if you're trying to make the point that things go back and forth, or it could be one direction in or out. Sometimes people use different thicknesses of arrows to represent a concept that feels like it's very tightly connected, and you could use thinner lines or dotted lines to represent links that are more either tangential or you're less sure of. But then that point that we're adding a phrase, a word or a phrase to the arrow, to the link that is telling us the nature of the connection. And that's a really key piece of concept maps. And I'm just noticing, I'm looking at Ken's comment in the chat that in many ways you can think of a concept map like writing an essay, right? In some ways, it's a similar type of process, that it's really about trying to conceptualize your understanding, lay it out in a clear way. In many ways, it's a lot like a visual outline. So how are we going to ask us to do concept maps in Lacunos? Because there's lots of ways to teach concept mapping. There's lots of ways to have kids engage in it. I'm proposing a model here that I like and I've used before, but of course, like everything we do in SMILE and in Lacunos, we want you to modify it, make it your own, use it in a way that makes sense to you, and use it in a way that will be effective with your students. So typically, and we're going to look at a model lesson in a minute that sort of walks through these steps, but I like to start with a guided discussion about the central topic, probably whole class, but it could be small group. Before people start doing anything, let's just talk about what are some of the big ideas, right? And then I like to partner students for this next part. We're using like a T-chart or just any sort of simple sort of way to list things. What are the big ideas? What are the concepts? And, you know, trying to think about sometimes what are the most important, and then maybe there's some secondary, you can sort of prioritize, but just trying to brainstorm if we're going to do a concept map on whatever topic, the topic before of plants, then what are some of the big ideas that we think ought to be in our concept map? And then on the other side of the T-chart, what are some connections? So what is a way that you see any connections between the concepts? So the example that I pulled here from the infectious diseases lesson that some of you are familiar with, some of the key concepts might be infectious disease, epidemiology, outbreak, reproduction number, and then one example of a connection, infectious diseases have a reproduction number. So in effect, that could go right on the concept map, right? Infectious diseases is a concept, reproduction number is a concept, and the linking arrow could be infectious diseases have a. It's not the strongest link, but it works. So that I think is an important piece to try to get some of the concepts down just in a list first. And then you can then I like to have students do a map individually. I've done paired maps, that's fine too. I like to have some paired planning, then individual work, and then come back and share what you've done and talk about it with your partner. That's a model that I have found works pretty well for me. You can give a blank piece of paper, or if you're just starting out, or if your students need more structure, of course, you've probably seen models where there's a partial map already completed. There's a couple of nodes filled in already to get them started, because sometimes it can be discouraging to stare at a blank piece of paper, right? So if your students need a head start, you can certainly give them a head start with a partial map already filled in. But then the idea is for them to expand on that. And it's really important for students to recognize there is no right answer for this. There can be, you know, things that don't make sense, but there's not one magical correct concept map. It's a mental model of how these ideas fit together for you. And so it's fine if your map looks different than somebody else's, but any student ought to be able to, once they've drafted their map, sort of explain it, right? It becomes then a visual representation that hopefully a student can then talk about with a partner and explain why they have connected things the way they have. If there is time, it can be really productive to then have students go back and revisit their maps, maybe use a second color and make any changes that they want to make. That can be hard to make time for that. It is really productive if you can get kids to do it, but I recognize people don't like to revise work, and so it can be a challenge, especially in a club setting, to try to get that kind of work done. But if you can give a chance to revise, it does tend to show important things. So that's kind of one model for how to walk through doing a concept map. And now I want to have us look at a model lesson that has this concept map built in as kind of the end of the lesson activity. And this is one of the lessons that we've developed for elementary around forestry. So if you're in middle or high, you know we've been developing a few forestry lessons with forestry faculty that are more at the secondary level. And at the January workshop, we will be sharing a few elementary forestry lessons, as well as some that are sort of elementary middle that secondary folks may want to adapt. But this is one of the elementary ones called If I Were a Tree. So like all of our Lacunos lessons, if you've been at these trainings and are familiar with our format, we always start with what we call a language booster, which is a short one-page reading that introduces some of the key concepts, introduces some back. So it's about treating basic needs and how trees meet their basic needs. We've got text, we've got a labeled diagram. We also have a link to a video. That's something we're going to be trying to build in more to the Lacunos lessons moving forward, is always trying to have a short video that goes along with the language booster that you can show or kids can watch. And then the language booster always ends with a few partner questions, things for students to partner up and do, talk about, write about. In this case, to either look out the window or go outside and look at a tree and then think about how are trees and people similar and different. Because what this lesson is really about as we move into the activity part, and this one's hands-on part is just sort of pencil and paper, but it's comparing our bodies and functions and structures as humans and the functions and structures of trees. And so students are going to do two things. They're going to start by looking at a tree. And so there's going to be a laminated sort of color picture of a tree. And then using the information from the language booster, students will use like wet erase markers, like Expo markers, to mark up the picture of the tree with the various pieces that have the functions of what a tree needs to survive. So they'll point to the bark and talk about how that's protection, and they'll point to the roots and talk about how that's uptake of nutrients and water. So they'll start by looking at a tree and doing that. And then we'll give you like big, like roll art paper big enough to do for a person to lie down, for the student to lie down and trace like their full size outline. And then they will think about what parts of their body serve that same function as the parts of the tree to serve those same roles. What protects us? How do we uptake nutrients? How do we, those same features. And if you scroll down to the very last page, Jay, past everything else, just to see there's past the concept cards. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I'm going to make you go back up, but just go to the very end, because so here's kind of the worksheet for them to think about it. There's one version that's completed, and then there's a blank version for them to then sort of, after they've thought about it and worked on it, then they can look at this and if they need some help to sort of connect what are the different pieces of the body and the tree. And so that's sort of the activity to get them thinking about these connections. And then if we go back up. To the, yep, right there. And after they have gone through looking at the tree and drawing the picture of their body, then scroll down to the next page. Here is the concept mapping page, just like we saw for the spreading diseases lesson. Here, the sort of focal question is, how are humans and trees similar and different? So the purpose of the concept map is to represent kind of their mental model of how humans and trees are similar and different in how we get our needs met. So we started a list of brainstorming some of the concepts like protection, support, nutrients, and then gave a couple examples of sort of connections between concepts. Human organs and tree parts have some of the same functions, and human skeleton has protection function like tree bark. So the idea would be that list from the earlier slide, students would be asked to general discussion, then partner discussion to fill out this table, and then be asked to, on a blank piece of paper, create their own individual concept map. We didn't put in a blank page here. Sometimes we put in a blank page with just like a space for them to do it, or they could do it right there, yep. And then we try to give this sample map and try to give a couple of guiding questions for, some students might feel stuck. So we always try to come up with a few questions you can give them or not give them, depending on what you think they need to sort of help them get going. And then hopefully they'll do their individual map and then get back together with their partner and compare it and contrast it and talk about similarities and differences. And then we are hoping to be able to collect these maps and take a look at them so that we can think about what it's showing us. So that's an example. And then we'll just show you the concept cards real quick. Most of you are familiar with our concept cards. This is another language support that we build into our Lacunos lessons for the key ideas. We do these bilingually with a kid-friendly definition, an image of some kind, and then a sentence that hopefully uses the word meaningfully. And so in the case of doing a concept map, these concept cards certainly are concepts that might well be included in the concept map. So if students need, again, more support, the concept cards can be another one of those supports. All right, I have been talking a lot. So that is the model lesson. So now we would like to think with you all a little bit about what seems feasible to you about using concept maps in your clubs. So we've got a couple reflection questions. We wonder how you think about using them, and maybe you already use concept maps. So how do you or how might you use concept maps with your students? And the second question, what additional support will you need or your students need to engage productively with concept maps? And then the third question, does it seem feasible to you to be able to conduct a concept map activity in your Smile Club between now and January? And there's actually a couple Lacunos activities that have the concept map option already built in, but of course it would be easy to add it to any of the activities. We could easily do that. And then I'm also curious, our team is curious, if there are other strategies, what other strategies do you already use to make student thinking visible? So those are some of our questions, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Jay now to see if we want to do breakout rooms.
Yes, so we have breakouts. There'll be 6 in each, and I've already assigned them. Right now, I'm thinking 15 minutes for those breakouts. Does that work for you, Corey?
Sure, sounds great. So as I mentioned, there are a few model lessons we've already developed that have the concept mapping piece built in. So if I were a tree, the one we just talked about today, which you don't have the materials for yet, but they're pretty simple and we're going to get those together for you. But also spreading infectious diseases and the vaccines lesson, if you were at that PD, both of those have a concept mapping version. At the January teacher workshop, we're going to do a secondary forestry activity on utilizing trees optimally, and that's going to have a concept mapping activity built in. And we will build in some more that have it explicitly, but really all of the activities that we've developed could, we could easily build this piece out. And our hope is we would love it if all Smile teachers try to get a couple concept map activities done in the remainder of the year, because we are hoping to be able to look, our goal on the research side is to be able to look at some students' concept maps over time as the year goes along, and if they have more experiences, to be able to look at some of the ways that maybe their language or their examples, the community connections, the knowledge, how it's building over time, right? And so we see this as sort of a longitudinal piece of the project that we're hoping that students will gain as they get more comfortable with concept maps, that we will get to sort of see their mental models of concepts become a little more clear and robust. So I wanted to ask if there were lessons, other Lacunos lessons that people want to do or have done that they feel like concept maps would be a good addition to. And I also wanted to talk about, we talked in our group about the possibility, depending on where clubs are, trying to come out and visit to help facilitate concept map activities, because in our group we talked about one of the challenges is that it's hard to do a concept map, and especially in Smile Club, which is mostly about hands-on and doing stuff that's engaging, it's not necessarily that motivating, and it takes some time and it's hard. And so if it would be helpful for a member of the Smile or of the Lacunos and Smile team to come out and help facilitate. So I guess what I'm asking is people can feel free to like call out and or in the chat. I guess I'm looking for a couple things. If there are activities that people are wanting to do in the next few weeks and include a concept map, then we would love to hear about it and let us know what support you need. Is it materials you need? Is it somebody coming to help co-facilitate that would be helpful. It would be great if we can do some of these things in the between now and the January workshop, for some of you anyway.
I'll reiterate really quickly as people are gathering thoughts. I will send this lesson out today using the Smile listserv. So you'll get the lesson most likely in PDF format. I can also send this presentation out. Once we get the video edited from this, it'll be posted on our website, and I will highlight that in the newsletter. So that's so you will have at least one activity in which you could do a concept map with.
Great. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to say, we discussed in our group, and maybe some other groups did too, ways to make concept maps more hands-on, potentially more engaging. One sort of simple one that I've seen done is to do like with yarn and like cut out, just from construction paper and sort of build it like that on a bulletin board or on poster paper. And I've seen that done with young children to make it more age appropriate, but I've also seen that done with older students just because it's just kind of fun and maybe silly and maybe makes it more fun.
Corey, do you only want concept maps from Smile? If we're doing something for our class, do you want to know about it too?
Yeah, we would love that. So if you're doing concept maps in regular classes, we would love to know about that. And if you're willing to share some of those, we would love to see those. Yeah, Ken.
Okay.
Yeah, we're hoping that people will try these out and Smile, and if you want to do it with other things with classes, then yeah, we'd love to support that.
So Corey, I have a question. Smile clubs are usually, an hour goes by really quickly, especially when we're also having a snack in there. And let's say we're going to take this tree activity and do it over 2 weeks or more in our Smile club. Could a concept map be something that students build on each week? So they start at week 1 and they build on it week 2 and then finish it week 3. Would that be possible?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no right way to do it. And again, we would love to sort of hear from you about what did you do with it? How did you do it in a way that made sense to you? What modifications did you make? How did you support it? Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Good. So I'm watching the clock. So I guess really, so feel free to put things in chat if you have ideas that you know about now, but otherwise, I guess reach out to us. We'll reach out to you to try to think about what you might want to try and how we can support it. And I guess with that, we can go to our last slide. So I would like to turn it over. I don't know if I turn it over to Jason or Elizabeth to say a quick thing about the feedback.
Sure. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Gandhi, and my colleague Jason is also on here as well. So we are doing the evaluation of the Lacunas project. So I'm going to be putting in the chat a link to a very short survey that we're hoping that you all can take that just asks a few questions about the PD itself. And we're going to be doing surveys like this after each of the PDs just to get your feedback. So thank you in advance for taking the time to complete it.
And we really appreciate that. We know that we get asked to take a survey on everything we buy, do, or see these days, but this really is important. And I promise you, we use this to try to make our programming better. So we really appreciate you taking a minute to do it. And I'll turn it over to Jay for final thoughts.
Yes, as I said before, I'm going to send it out, but if you do have any specific needs or you're thinking about doing a concept map for another Lacunos or other Smile activity, you can either contact me directly at j.well@oregonstate.edu or use the Smile program email that's listed there. Both of those go to me and I can help you either get those materials or think about ways that we can use concept mapping in other activities. Again, we're having professional development sessions at least once every term. We're kicking off the year fast and furious here with this one. But know that the incentives for these for Lacunos will be coming out after the teacher workshop. We'll have a list at the teacher workshop of those individuals that have attended PD sessions and also have done Lacunos Club logs. And we'll just verify that with you so we don't miss anyone at the teacher workshop. And then those will be paid out shortly after those payments plan to go out the week after the teacher workshop. And just wanted to know if there's any further questions. And if there's not, I will be hanging around here afterwards to can answer any Smile specific questions or questions about the workshop coming up. We do appreciate your time. We know you're busy, especially this year, and appreciate your time coming to this PD session and look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Thanks, everyone. And I'll stick around too if anybody has any questions for me. Otherwise,
Thank
hope
you.
to see you in the end of the month.